sorry, somebody's wrong, yeah.
Yeah, I think this time it should be okay because people are prepared. Everybody prepared.
Yeah, for that.
Yeah.
The last time I think it's just caught.
Yeah, nobody
off
thought
guard.
about it can go to that
In
extent.
the U.S. I was born in Liberia. That's the kind of stuff you could. I never could have imagined seeing that generous. I couldn't believe it.
I was
I
surprised.
was.
Yeah.
I didn't think it would. I never imagined it would get to that. I just never thought I would see that.
Nobody, most people do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on Earth. You just can't imagine that something like that could happen.
See, but they could have detected it though too. You know, if they had read some of the websites, the social media, stuff was boiling up. You know, and then
People say stuff, but you don't expect it to materialize. At least I did.
Having lived in
Like
D.C.
shadow.
Yeah, I mean, you know, back then the federal places were very lightly guarded. Very lightly guarded. I mean, I lived in D.C.
Yeah.
and I always worried about that, how lightly guarded. I'm sure they're guarded now. Yeah.
Good time.
Oh, okay.
We can wait a few minutes, or we can do it now, whatever you suggest. Are we on camera also?
I think so.
I don't know. I think we do.
Doing a microphone check for anyone who is on Zoom. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you, and we can see the title. I can see the title of this slide.
Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. Appreciate that. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing Dr. DeShield and Dr. Simpkins. And this is near and dear to my heart because this is, again, the Dean's Lecture Series, which means it's information which is of interest to all of us. And what's special about tonight is we're going to talk about the startup space. What we provide in academic medicine, which is unique, it's not the delivery of healthcare. That happens in many settings, in many ways, in many forms. What's unique about academic medicine is creativity, innovation, creation. And at the heart of that is our ability to connect with the individual patient and to benefit society. And therefore, there has to be a translational arm to what we do. And by the translation, I mean products and services. So the industrial space is critically important for us to demonstrate our success in terms of on the discovery side of things. And so what you're going to hear tonight is about discovery in a very interesting place which many of us are not accustomed to being. And that's the beauty of innovation, is it allows you to think way outside of the box and to create and provide services that benefit society profoundly. So I think you're going to be extremely interested in tonight's conversation. If I may, I'd like to initially introduce Dr. Harven DeShield. Dr. DeShield is the CEO and COO of Vivacelle. He secured his Bachelor's of Science degree at Appalachian State University, and he's a double doctor. He's a PhD of biochemistry from SUNY Buffalo, and he is also a doctor juris with concentration in IP, intellectual property, also from SUNY Buffalo. When you are dealing with the startup space, there are 3 or 4 questions that you will be asked when you have a great idea and you want to start the next Google. One question is, what is the novelty of what you are proposing to do? Another question is, who is the team? A third question is, do you have any money? And the fourth question, which sometimes leads the whole conversation, is, what's your IP? What is your intellectual property? Because if you don't have what's Dr. DeShield's specialty in hand, you really don't have anything. It's all about intellectual property and figuring out whether you have a perimeter of safety that you can operate within that allows you to exercise your ideas and to do something really, truly novel. And so we are very interested in Dr. DeShield's wisdom. Let me tell you about my friend, Dr. Cuthbert Simpkins II, if I may. He is the founder and chief innovation officer of Vivacelle. He is the Soslan, Missouri Endowed Chair in Trauma Services. He's a graduate of Amherst College and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Simpkins became a surgeon at SUNY Downstate, where he trained. He took a one-year leave in Harvard to write a book on John Coltrane, and I will give you an abstract on that book, which was extremely well received. He then went through a series of places, as did I, as did many of us. Perth Amboy General Hospital, Boston University School of Medicine, U.S. Navy Medical Research Institute, DC General Hospital, University of Maryland, R.A. Cowley Shock Trauma Center, which is the shock trauma center on the planet, SUNY Buffalo, Tri-State Trauma System, Erie, Pennsylvania, Nassau University Medical Center, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, LSU Health Sciences Center as Chief of Trauma, Rapides Regional Medical Center, Lutheran Hospital of Indiana, and he thankfully culminated this by coming to the best of all places, UMKC, in 2022. Thank you for that, Dr. Simpkins. He is the sole inventor on 58 patents. And at the Naval Medical Research Center, he secured grant funding to the extent of $5.3 million in doing the work, some of which will be discussed tonight. He has 56 original reports to his credit. I promised I would tell you something about his book on John Coltrane, and this is part of one of the reviews. There's a biography of John Coltrane written by C.O. Simpkins, where the narrative is very poetic. It almost seems to emulate Coltrane's music in its rhythm, tone, and phrasing. He takes a lot of liberty with standard narrative form, and I think what makes the book so satisfying is those elements of poetry present in the storytelling. And so discovery demands people who are artistic, who think outside of the box, who are unconventional, and that's why we're here to celebrate what they will share with us tonight. Gentlemen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, a quick question. Can we record this? Because several faculty asked me if it would be recorded because they're unable to attend.
Dr. Nichols, this is Christopher. Just letting you know that I did put the link in the chat. So there is a link. It is being recorded.
Oh, thank you. I just didn't see the record on my screen, the record button on my screen. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're recording it outside of Zoom. So,
oh, I see. Okay, great. Wonderful. Thanks.
Dean Norbash and fellow faculty, students, friends, and other interested parties, I want to express my gratitude for that eloquent introduction and for the opportunity to present the work that came from the little light that resides in all of us. It's so important for that little light to be preserved in order for one to invent. I think that the little light is snuffed out in our society more than it should, and those of us who have had it preserved are very blessed indeed. So the beginning of my talk is going to be on the challenges to the little light inside of me and how it was preserved. And then I'll go on to say to you how that light was expressed in the concepts that I learned through my education and experience that I was blessed to receive. I'm from Northwest Louisiana, Shreveport, Louisiana. And at the time I was there, we had segregation. You can see here that the black man is standing up because you had the white section that was in the front and the black section was in the back. And when the white section filled up, then you had to get up and give your seat to people in the white section. So he's standing up. This is the library, the main library in Louisiana. And one of the things that made me very, I would say, concerned and angry when I was a boy was that I couldn't go to this library. I wasn't allowed to go to it. These are my parents. My mother here was arrested because she sat on the front of the bus. And my father told black boys that their parents paid taxes too, and they have a right to go to the library. So they went to the library and they beat them and they arrested my father. This is the police chief that arrested both my mother and my father. This is the mayor under whose jurisdiction that arrest occurred and who interrogated my father. This is the kind of terror that we had to deal with. This is a postcard that was sent out. I show these pictures because they shouldn't be forgotten. This is the gun that my father gave me to help defend our family when I was 8. So my job was to help defend our family. This is the house that was bombed. My father said he would give me a lab because I was very interested in science early on. And way back at the end there was where my lab was supposed to be. Because he said if I blew up the lab, it wouldn't blow up the whole house. Somebody blew up the house before I did. This is my family. We were refugees in our own country. We had no money. We had nothing. We were at my grandmother's house. And yet, my mother would hang this picture up in my room and say, this is who you look like. These are black intellectuals. That's who you are. And that's the way I always thought of myself, as someone who should be a thinker. It was my right, as everyone else's, to be a thinker, to be a creator. And I thought I looked like them until I looked at them maybe when I was 30-something. I said, you don't really look like them. But my mother had me convinced that I was them. We have here Langston Hughes, the great poet, Charles Johnson, the great sociologist, E. Franklin Frazier, the sociologist, Rudolph Fisher, who was a physician and an inventor, and Hubert Delaney, who was a civil rights attorney in Harlem back in the 1920s. My father took me to a pond one day and got some pond water and put some dry grass into it and said, look at it with the microscope I bought you after about 3 days. And I saw paramecia and I was fascinated. I saw them darting around. They had a little salt that would swim faster, and I would do experiments of my own in my house or wherever I was, and this really got me started. So I went on to Amherst College over on the left and Harvard Medical School, and then the Downstate Medical Center where I studied under Dr. Samuel Kuntz, who was the surgeon from Arkansas, black surgeon, who discovered that high doses of steroids will inhibit the rejection reaction. That's fundamental to all transplantation. For Dr. Kuntz, you had to have an identical twin in order to get a transplant. And he did the first transplant between someone who was not an identical, whose donor was not an identical twin. So I was blessed to be, but Dr. Kuntz became ill, and I wasn't able to finish under him. And I went on to work with Dr. Lindsay Grandison. After I finished my residency, I had to decide whether I wanted to do private practice or whether I wanted to make a contribution. And I decided I wanted to make a contribution, so I volunteered. I worked for nothing in Dr. Grandison's lab, and he taught me, started teaching me how to do science. I continued when I joined the Navy. This is the Naval Medical Research Institute. This is me and my wife, Diane, in the Navy. Dr. Adam McKee was the director of the Institute, and he made sure that I had space to develop as a scientist. And he also determined that we would focus on septic shock back in the 1980s. This is before we discovered a lot of the pathophysiology that we know now. This is my first paper. First paper was on septic shock. And what I demonstrated here was that human neutrophil migration towards bacteria, a bacterial peptide, was enhanced by a brain peptide, beta endorphin. And at that time, there was a great deal of interest in the connection between the brain and the periphery. So this was an early paper actually in that area, and it was very well received. And it got me a commendation from the Navy for the research. And then I looked at other things that might inhibit neutrophil function over here on the left, there's prostaglandin D2. I found that prostaglandin D2 inhibited superoxide production from neutrophils. And what I also proved was that that carbonyl group, there's a pointer here, that carbonyl group, where is it? Where's the pointer? Right here? Right here. Okay. This carbonyl group was very important because I used another compound that had a hydroxyl group here, and it had no activity, but prostaglandin D2 was important. And then I saw that naloxone had a rigid planar configuration here, and a carbonyl group here also. And I surmised, well, maybe naloxone, which we know is important in reversing opioids at the mu receptor, would also act like prostaglandin D2 and inhibit superoxide production. And this was the first paper on that subject, and I demonstrated that naloxone does and did indeed, as predicted, inhibit superoxide production from neutrophils. And I didn't patent it. I didn't know. They had no idea of patenting. Had no idea of significance. It was interesting to me. I was thrilled. My colleagues were thrilled, but there was nothing about it at all. And it went on to become a product that somebody else commercialized. Because this is what happens a lot, I think, among scientists. We discover things and we don't determine whether or not it's patentable, whether or not there's any intellectual property potential involved. But it's used now to treat rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease and colitis, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, Parkinson's disease, autism, thyroid disorders, Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune and chronic conditions. And actually, based on my research, they haven't fully exploited it, because I found that the stereoisomer of naloxone, which has no activity at the mu receptor, is also just as effective. And the importance of that is that if you give naloxone, patients will be more sensitive to pain if you give a lot of naloxone. It'll have other side effects. But giving plus naloxone, the stereoisomer naloxone, gives you the same anti-inflammatory effect without any of the action at the mu receptor. And that was the importance of this. That hasn't been fully exploited, but it is on the market now. The next thing I saw was that a very unusual thing. I noted that when I added tyrosine phenylalanine, a peptide, to cytochrome C, this is the absorbance spectrum, this is the absorbance here, this is the wavelength here, I got a peak right here. Got this little peak, and it wouldn't go away. And I don't usually like to deal with things that are small differences in science. I like dramatic differences. But this wouldn't go away. And I began to look at it. Why would tyrosine phenylalanine reduce cytochrome C? Why would it transfer electrons? It's not, you're a biochemist. Why would that happen? No one could answer that. And I couldn't answer it. And so we explored it further, and I found that tyrosine phenylalanine did the same thing. It did it much more effectively than this. And this was another possibly patentable, actually patentable observation that was made that I didn't patent. I didn't patent that. And so what we have here is a unique, unprecedented, unknown mechanism for transferring electrons to a very important molecule that's involved with apoptosis and many other processes. And this hasn't been commercially exploited either, actually. I think because it's not possible to profit from it now, because I published this, and so a company can have exclusivity in the intellectual property. It's not going to go forward with it. But this is something else that was patentable. And I will say, when my wife is listening, I'll admit that she kept telling me that I should patent this. And I kept telling her that I didn't think it was necessary. So listen to your wife or your husband or your partner, whoever cares about you. And this is septic shock. As I told you, Dr. McKee started the entire institute on the problem of septic shock. And there was a lot about septic shock that we didn't know. I had the good fortune to work with an excellent scientist at the Naval Medical Research Institute, Thomas McKenna, who first demonstrated that the cytokines, tumor necrosis factor, and interleukin-1 act at the endothelial cell and cause the release of what we called at the time endothelium-derived relaxing factor. We didn't know it was nitric oxide. So we got all up to that step. But we were really kind of unraveling what's going on here. And so septic shock is very critical. I mean, it's 49 million people get septic shock, get sepsis every year. 350,000 people die every year in the United States, and 10 million people die every year in the world. That's probably an undercount. Many things have been tried: endotoxin blockade, cytokine blockade. Zygris was a big bust, so forth and so on. Nothing worked. Very frustrating. But I got the idea. How I got the idea would take up another hour to describe it. It's a very circuitous, nonlinear, difficult to understand kind of pathway, maybe Brownian motion pathway, you would say. But anyway, came up with the idea that the thing to do was not to try to block something that makes nitric oxide, because there's so much redundancy in various cytokines and prostaglandins and other kinins and so forth, and other mediators that are released in sepsis. But at the top of it, of all the pathophysiologies in the trapezoid, at the top of the trapezoid you have nitric oxide. If you can control nitric oxide, then you can actually treat septic shock. And that was attempted by blocking the enzyme, that's the rate-limiting enzyme in the production of nitric oxide synthase. However, nitric oxide is necessary for very basic, fundamental processes, such as oxidative phosphorylation, regulation of cardiac contractility. These are things that are necessary. So in that clinical trial, when the nitric oxide synthase was blocked, the mortality rate went up. And so here we are. So we had to figure out a different way, different approach altogether. And this approach was one when we looked at the chemistry of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a lipophilic molecule. And it's a lipophilic molecule that would prefer to localize into hydrophobic environments. And the idea here was to create these nanoparticles. On the left here, you have the hydrophobic area created by soybean oil that's stabilized by phosphatidylcholine. And then you have a lipid bilayer, this green area that is here, that's also hydrophobic. And so the idea here was that where there's too much nitric oxide, it would be overproduced and then enter into these hydrophobic areas. Here, this yellow area of the micelle, and this lipid bilayer. And that would reduce the bioavailability of nitric oxide without stopping its production or any of its important autocrine or paracrine interactions. So that was the fundamental idea. The other idea was that in the microcirculation, there are parts of the microcirculation where there's too much nitric oxide and parts where they're too low. And the idea is that these particles would release the nitric oxide where there's insufficient nitric oxide. So where there's too much, this bioavailability would be reduced by these nanoparticles. Where there's too little, it would be delivered and released and delivered into the microcirculation where it's needed. That was the idea. And the FDA let us try it. Let us try it and go right to phase 2, because these kinds of particles are known to be safe. These particles are usually used to carry something. Hydrophobic molecules are put into micelle over here on the left, and hydrophilic molecules are put into liposomes to carry something. It's like you have a box and you have some gold in the box, but you never test what's what the box does. And so we looked at the boxes, and the boxes had the properties that we were looking for. This has got the first patent here, and that I did patent. Now listen to my wife. And I got this patented, filed the patent in 2008, and it was issued on November 22nd, 2011. This is the first patent for hypovolemia. Harven knows how to articulate it better than I do. So, but it's for relative and absolute hypovolemia. Right, Harven?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And then at that time, I formed a company called Innovative. Someone said, you need to commercialize this. I had a cousin who was an attorney, and the patent attorney said, you need to commercialize. I didn't really know what that meant. And so I formed a company called Innovative. My wife and I formed a company called Innovative Resuscitation Technology. And what we didn't understand that this startup business is different from other business. And we had friends who were business people. They were successful business people, but we spent about 5 years with them, not getting anywhere. I would present to a venture capitalist group, and they would say, we love your technology, we don't like your management. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And then I met Harven, met some other people, and we all founded the Vivacelle Bio. This is our management team. It's me, Harven. Krishna Taluri is our chief medical officer. Mukesh Kumar is our senior vice president for regulatory affairs. These people make their living doing this. That's what's important. They make their living doing this. And that's what you have to have in order to move the company ahead. Our company has moved ahead since that time. In the clinical trial, it was very successful. We had a primary endpoint of increasing the mean arterial pressure by at least 10. And also, the secondary endpoint was reducing the dose of vasopressors. We achieved 100% efficacy with the first primary endpoint. And also, we achieved highly statistically significant efficacy with the secondary endpoint. In addition, we got improvement in oxygenation and improvement in renal function, improvement in liver function, and reduction in inflammation. So this was a very successful trial. It was supposed to be just a pilot trial, and the FDA allowed it to be a full phase 2 and allowed us to go on to phase 3. The other part of this is hypovolemia. We wanted to apply the same technology to blood loss. And I'll show you this. I hope this works. Okay. Here, over here, we are giving the rat anesthesia. There's a candle on your right, measuring the blood pressure. And one of the scientists in my lab, Shali, probably, is putting in the catheter into the rat's right femoral artery. And now we're going to remove enough blood so that the rat is clinically dead. This is like a patient who comes in who's lost a lot of blood very rapidly and is not breathing and has no pulse. You can see the rat breathing now. Okay, the rat is apneic, clinical death, and we're going to replace. And I will say Dr. Shali designed this model. Thank you. And watch the animals breathing again now. The animal's reanimated. And this goes on. This surprised us. We thought we would have to give the animal blood after this. We watched the animal for 12 hours under anesthesia, and then we wake them up, repair the wounds, wake them up, and then allow them to live for the next 30 days. during which we measure cognitive function with the Y maze and motor function with the force plate actimeter, and there's no abnormality whatsoever. The other thing, though, is if you look at here, this is a histology, lung histology of rats that had been under anesthesia after this procedure for 12 hours. And so A is the lung of a rat, of a sham rat. The rat was giving anesthetic, the arteries were cannulated, but nothing was infused, nothing was removed. And you can see this is a pretty normal looking lung. And then in the middle, B, you see very disrupted lung structure from blood. This is what blood does to you. I mean, you know, if you think about it, I mean, you wouldn't really want this to happen, but this is the best we have is blood right now. Over on the right, at C, we have what happens with VBI1. There is no difference between VBI1 infusion and sham. And there's a bar graph here where we look at 6 animals. This is a lung cumulative damage score. You can look at sham, it's only a score of 2, VBI1 is a score of 2, but blood is 6. And this, we see this in every organ we look at. We see this in the brain, the heart, the kidney, the liver, the pancreas. We see the same thing. We see, so we have something here. This is very significant. We have something here that elevates the blood pressure as well as blood without causing the ischemia reperfusion injury that blood causes. It's better than blood. In our lab, we say, if we bleed, don't give us blood. Give us VBI1. So we think that we will be able to augment the world's blood supply. Phospholipid nanoparticles supply is nearly unlimited. Blood is limited. You don't have to type and cross it or match it. There's no potential for transfusion reaction. Phospholipid nanoparticles are stable at room temperature for at least 1 year, and that's as far as we've gone with the stability testing, but probably more longer than that. And blood is only stable for 42 days refrigerated. We don't have to screen for disease. You're not going to get disease from VBI1, and VBI1 doesn't cause reperfusion injury. The market for VBIS is 5.6 billion. For VBI1 is 8.1 billion. And these are other products. We have a pipeline of products because this technology is really just the beginning. We're at the beginning right now, but it can be applied to many other diseases, including lethal infection and many other diseases, which I won't go over here. This is part of our team here. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Any questions at all? Maybe we should let you go forward, then we take questions. How about that? Okay.
I have a question if
Sure.
there's time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Mark Nichols online. Have you looked at what happens with bone marrow production, you know, the blood stem cells and all the rest of that in animals where you've given VBI? Do you get back to normal production or does it?
That's the right question. We haven't answered it yet, though. We're getting there. We have to catch up. I mean, we've got these effects and we have to invest. We have so much to investigate. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
We're going to be looking at the long-term effects and repeated injections. And what we're doing really is changing the biophysical properties of the blood. And we're going to see how patients may benefit from that.
Yeah, I was wondering, for example, the immune response, you know, if you get new antibodies or, you know, as you go out in time, whether some of that's compromised or if it repopulates again.
We're collaborating with Dr. Hassan, who's an immunologist, on that, and we're actively pursuing that question.
Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, Dr. Simpkins, for that greatly inspirational presentation. And thank you, Dean Novak, for the invite to participate in this lecture and everybody else involved in organizing the lecture. Thanks to everyone for being present here today, as well as on the Zoom. So I presented this slide not so much to show, all the different things I've been involved in, but just to sort of make the point that there's sort of like the theme here is flexibility and the fact that, so I started off way back, started off wanting to go to med school, but I was born in Liberia, first of all, West Africa, just for context. So by the time I made it here, we had a civil war in Liberia, so lots of all that stuff. I made it, finished undergrad. The timing just wasn't right, so I went into graduate school and what have you. And by the time I was done with mine, almost done with my PhD, and then, it's sort of too late now to go to med school with family and all of this stuff. So as my mother would say, well, if you're going to be there doing a degree for 6-7 years, you better get something out of it. So I decided to go to law school, combine the two, increase my chances, I guess, of making it. But while in law school, I did a sort of like an externship at a business management life sciences company. And that was very instrumental to my pathway because it impressed upon me the importance of serving as a liaison, a conduit, right, there's a disconnect between scientists, pure scientists, and then call it the business world, VCs, people that can fund stuff that they're doing, separate and independent from getting grants. And in biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, time is of the essence. You don't have time. If you take too long, you have to do everything at a very fast pace, and sometimes waiting on the government grants can take too long. You need to try to, bring all the efforts to equity as well as applying for the grants and what have you. And having, I worked as, I started off drafting patents, but then I went into patent litigation. And what that gives you, it's a whole nother purview as to it's one thing to get claims in patents, but you need to get claims that are worth something in terms of being able to it should be commercially viable, right? So a patent attorney can get you just about anything, right? But how valuable, commercially valuable are those claims that are issued at the end of the patent process, which takes about 2 to 3 years. And then in addition to that, the claims you get, when you get a patent, is presumed to be valid. So after all that time, what you have is something that's presumed to be valid. It doesn't mean that your claims are necessarily going to hold up, right? If somebody infringes it or if you have to sue somebody over it. So it's important when, to work with your patent prosecutor to make sure that the claims that are being pursued, the finalized claims, can stand up to litigation. So that's extremely important. And you'll see some other reasons why that's important. But having worked on both sides, and then, the business development angle, where I worked in sort of, head of strategy and corporate development, which involves raising funds and what have you, worked across oncology, a little bit for a med device company, and then as well as Vivacelle, taking a startup company to clinical stage involves a whole lot of being able to multitask. We work 7 days a week. Basically, it's not a 9-to-5 thing. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into all of that. I'll get into the presentation now. So in the U.S. Constitution, way back, they recognized the importance of granting. It's a legal monopoly. You get about 20 years, but the trade-off is that you have to fully disclose, but eventually you have to. It's all about promotion of the progress of science. I think Dean Norbert mentioned something about, making. It's important to get the knowledge out there. The whole point of giving you a patent is to promote the progress of science, eventually also for the public good. That's what you're trying to do. So it's important to have the commercialization arm in hand. The patents are not meant to be just sort of like for bragging rights or paper somewhere. You have to figure out how to commercialize everything. So the other, besides patents, there's trade secrets, which in this space it can be It usually is technical and non-technical know-how, but those are actually separate, call it intellectual property rights as well. If something's a trade secret, then you have to make sure that it remains a trade secret. So you have to take steps to keep it confidential and secured and what have you. That's a whole nother, realm of they have a whole, there's people that practice that, how to, maintain trade secrets. The most famous one being Coca-Cola that everybody knows about. But obviously, it's still people, when you go to the supermarket and you see all those colas, they're trying, but they never can quite get there. So it gives you an idea of how long you can actually maintain a secret. The benefit is it's not 20 years, it can be forever. So that's the main distinction between the two. People can reverse engineer it. That's the downside. And as long as they can show that they didn't steal it from you or what have you, so that's the risk there, keeping something as only a trade secret. So what is a patent? It's essentially a federal grant, right, that allows you to exclude others from making, using, selling, importing, exporting that product that's in the claimed invention. It's usually for about 20 years. Depending on when the patent application was filed and what have you. Why do you need exclusivity? It's important so that you have to have these barriers so that people can be able to commercialize the product. In order to go through clinical trials and all of that stuff requires a lot of money. So it's an incentive. They give you that. The 20 years is an incentive so that people can go into coming up with new innovations and what have you. Now, there's a key distinction here. This is an example. Just because you have the patent doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to practice it, right? So that's called freedom to operate. You have to make sure that you have freedom to operate in addition to just having the patent. This example is, say, the first patent covers a new drug. It contains these three elements of the patent claim. And then somebody else goes and the second prior patent that covers a composition includes only these two, A and B. The prior patent, however, excludes the patentee of the new drug from practicing this composition of A and B because A and B was already part of ABC, right? So those A and B, those are elements of the invention. So again, just because you receive the patent doesn't mean that it's just presumed to be valid. There's lots of issues that can come up when you go to try to actually practice your patent. It could actually infringe somebody else's patent. So it's very complicated, and you kind of have to work through all of that sort of stuff with your patent attorney and make sure that you don't end up with an essentially sort of worthless patent. So these are the five common reasons why sometimes you can't patent stuff during the patent prosecution process. The most famous one, most people can, the invention has to have utility. It has to be, useful. Most people can get around that. That's an easy enough element to get around, right? Like, for example, recombinant insulin for treating hyperglycemia. So that's utility. Most people can, purported inventions can show that. Novelty, you can't patent something that's already patented before. That's essentially what that means. The main difference with novelty versus what's called obviousness, right? And when we say obviousness here, the patent can be obvious to people of ordinary skill in the art. So if let's say you invent something, you're a trauma surgeon, and you invent some new method of doing something or a new surgical device, whatever you invented, to people that other trauma surgeons or people that actually make surgical medical devices, it can't be obvious to them. So you can't say, well, if it was obvious, how come nobody did it? So lay people always say that, right? And that's not the kind of obviousness that they're talking. They're talking about obviousness from the purview of people of what they say, a person of ordinary skill in the art. They call it POSA for the acronym, right? So that's what we're talking about there. The main difference between obviousness and novelty For the patent examiner, so this is the person at the patent office that's gonna, the back and forth with the government, the process that takes about 2 to 3 years before you secure the patent. They can only rely on one prior art. So prior art is anything that was out there. They're saying that it's already out there. Can't patent something that somebody else already did. They're not allowed to combine more than one, right? To try to show all the elements of your invention or your claims is already in this prior art, right? They can only rely on one prior art. Obviousness is a different story. They can combine as many different pieces of prior art to get at that. Very hard to get around obviousness. You can get around, a lot of times you can get around novelty. Obviousness is a whole different game. It often seems like, they're kind of moving the goalposts because in some ways though, even though I said, yes, you can combine more than one prior art, the more prior art somebody has to come up with, and usually this goes on different, multiple rounds, but if a patent examiner is having to, keep finding new prior art and combining it and with this, that, and other, usually that's a sign that probably your invention is, going to sail through as long as you can keep making the arguments and keep knocking the prior art down. That's kind of, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you still end up not getting it, but that's usually a good sign. If they have like 50 different combinations just to get at your invention, they're trying a little bit too hard usually. Because usually, if it's really non-obvious, a few pieces of prior art should do the trick, maybe 3 or 4 different combinations, but not like 20 different combinations. So that's kind of the main distinction. The other important piece is what they call the invention has to be adequately described, right? So you have to show that you really possess that invention, and that's based on your description. The other reason why this is important is that so the government grants you this legal monopoly, but you're supposed to not hide stuff, right? Because when your patent ends, people should be able, the public and anybody else should be able to read your disclosure and be able to practice what you invented. So you have to fully describe everything. You can't keep anything as a trade secret, right? If you wanted to do that, then you shouldn't have filed a patent. You can't have it both ways. You either keep it as a trade secret and don't disclose, but if you decide to patent it, you have to fully describe it. So that's why that's important. And if you don't describe it, your claims can be rejected also, that it's not fully described. And that means that you don't really possess what you say you have. The last one that comes up all the time is, I think I left off one of this. It's supposed to be the enablement. That's actually a very important one, right? Lack of enablement. So in this space, what that really means is that, do you have data to back up stuff? Like that's where the experimentation and the quality of your data really matters, right? You have to show as many different, if you want, especially all the different embodiments, those are just different aspects of the invention, and they have to be fully supported. Yeah, the different embodiments, the experiments have to support what you're claiming. So if you can get a rejection, if the claims that you get are not fully enabled, right? You're describing stuff, but you don't show any proof. And that in this space, in the pharmaceutical biotechnology space, that's primarily shown by just in the type of experimental data that you have, the results and that kind of stuff. Actually, it is on there, so the enabling right there. So it often comes up, so you have, usually arises when a genus claims are supported by a limited number of species described in the application. You have to make sure you have ample experiments to describe and provide adequate support for all of the different aspects of the invention. For example, if you describe, a simple example would be, let's say you came up with the rotary phone, right? That was your invention. But somehow you're smart enough to realize that maybe there's going to be smartphones way back, but you don't have any support for that. But you still go ahead and try to claim that. So you'll get a lack of enablement. You could get a lack of enablement, right? They'll say, well, you have evidence of an analog, phone, regular phone. You don't have any evidence. You don't have any experimentation. That's basically the lack of enablement, right? You don't show any proof that you actually invented, that we should give you an invention for smartphones. Just because you can conceive of it. Conception is one part of the invention. There's two parts. You have to have conception and then the reduction to practice. So those are the two. But that reduction to practice has to be supported by experimentation. They're not going to give you the big, cell phones, even though you just came up with a rotary phone. So that's sort of the example there. So what are some practical implications? Always ensure that the scope of your patent claims keeps up with your research and development and commercial manufacturing strategies and goals. So sometimes there's a disconnect, especially in big companies, but it can happen in even smaller companies also. You're patenting one thing, and this happens because sometimes you get the patents years in advance, and then you find out that you have a technical problem that you're later on trying to solve, right? And so there can be a disconnect between your patent claims and a technical scientific problem that happened, afterwards. So it's a good idea to make sure that you carefully coordinate everything you're doing in your lab, including any technical issues that come up with if your patent application is being prosecuted at that time. You want to make sure to inform your patent prosecutor to include that. Those changes, those technical solutions that you're coming up with. You don't want to end up with claims that don't cover stuff that you solve later on. You don't want there to be a disconnect. That's extremely important. And sometimes people get stuck with that. So you have to always closely coordinate anything you're doing in the lab must be closely coordinated with your patent attorney as they're prosecuting your patent applications. This is also very important. If you know of the closest prior art, and once you have to keep in mind, again, the goal is to get something commercially viable and out there. If you're in a particular field, and you know what the standard of care is, you probably should design your experimentation, whether it's preclinical, in this stage, most of the time preclinical or almost close to filing an IND. You should include the closest prior art, if possible, so that you can see that you can show to someone that your product is superior to that. And that also, not only does it help you secure a patent, because the patent office will be impressed by that. This is the standard of care. You're going up against the standard of care. You're going up against the standard of care and you're showing superiority. So usually, that's kind of patentable usually if you can get across any other prior art. Obviously, it helps with respect to enablement, right? It shows that you actually invented something. So, and then in addition to that, it helps in terms of, inform you when you go to file an IND or to do a clinical trial. You would get a sense of how to design that clinical trial so that you can have success. So basically, you should try to, as best as possible, you should try to replicate, if possible, what you think you're going to show in your clinical trial. Try to do that at the preclinical stage, because you're kind of getting a jump on stuff, and you may run into some issues there that you will have the opportunity to correct and say, no, we should not design the clinical trial this way, because it's not going to show, it may not show the kind of benefit you think. So it might lead you to design your clinical trial another way. So that's important. It's always best in academic settings, it's best to avoid silos. There's when it sounds cliche, but there is strength in numbers. So, it's always good if you can to work in a cross-disciplinary fashion, because oftentimes you can end up with a much broader patent that covers more stuff. Somebody is in the physics department doing something, somebody else is in the biology or chemistry department, everybody's working solo, But if they combine their efforts together, number one, they have a better shot at securing non-dilutive funding. But in addition to that, which is important to move things along, in addition to that, it's also good if you may end up with more robust patents by doing that, and more robust inventions. Because when people talk across departments, sometimes when you're in a silo, you may not be thinking about all the possible embodiments of your invention. Because you're just working alone, you may not be seeing additional applications of your invention. So it's always good to cross-talk as much as possible. Of course, if anybody contributes towards any inventive step, all of you guys have to be listed on the patents as inventors. And if you don't do that, your patents can actually be invalidated. So that's also important. So you don't get to cooperate, and they help to come up with inventive stuff, and then you try to keep somebody off the patent. So it kind of goes hand in hand. I think I already talked about this, that designing the superior studies, clinical studies, you have to make sure that you don't want to end up with, if you're designing your, let's say, clinical trial, if you're up at that stage, you should make sure that your clinical trial, the results are going to be supported by your patent claims, and the indication that you're trying to get from the FDA needs to be covered by the scope of your patent claims. Now, you can get regulatory exclusivity that may have nothing to do with the scope of your patent claims. In other words, the FDA is not going to say to you, we're approving this drug for heart attacks, but your patent claims don't cover heart attacks. That's on you. They don't care. They'll approve it, right? They don't have to match it up for you. But if you don't get some other type of regulatory exclusivity, for example, if it's not a new chemical, if it's a new chemical entity, you get automatic, I believe it's 7 years, right? Exclusivity. So that's great, right? But even if you don't have patent, meaning from the day it gets approved, they're not going to approve any other generic product if that's a new chemical entity. But if it's not a new chemical entity, you want to make sure that the patent covers what's on that label, right? Whatever, if it's approved for heart disease or treatment of heart attack or whatever the indication is, that should be covered by the scope of your patent claims. Seems pretty straightforward, but you'll be surprised. There's always disconnect when you're doing multiple things, and sometimes the drug works for one thing better than what's covered by the patent. So things like that, it does come up. You want to have a thicket of patent protection, right? Because that's why people discuss this in terms of patent portfolios. Because if they can get around claims in one patent, you want to make sure that they'll be stopped by your other patents. So you get a mixture covering different aspects of the invention. Keep your attorney informed of all improvements to make sure that, everything you do should be covered by your existing patent portfolio. The issue of, Dr. Simpkins mentioned this earlier, you have to make sure you coordinate. I know in academic settings, everybody's trying to publish, rush to publish, but you have to coordinate that with your patent filings so that you don't end up creating prior art against yourself. In the US, you get a 1-year grace period, but in the EU, that can impact you, impede your ability to get a foreign patent. So you want to make sure that you file a PCT, let's say, which is a kind of like a global patent application that allows you to pursue US claims, EU claims, and then you're covered, right? Even if then you publish. It's always better to file a patent, at least put something on file before you publish, just in general. You want to keep track of competitive technology as it publishes so that you can maybe improve your follow-on patents, which are called, for example, continuation patents and that stuff. It's important to just know what the competition is doing. The other thing is, it's called like evergreening. So you want to try to expand the time of your patents, right? So one way, if you have a new chemical entity, depending on the molecule and stuff, if it's an enantiomer, that's the best way that people do to get fresh 20 years. But you have to show that the other additional enantiomers, believe it or not, even though an enantiomer, the technology of isolating it and what have you, that's pretty routine now, right? But they're not giving you the patent because of that. They're giving you the patent because there's no guarantee when you isolate a different enantiomer of a drug that it's going to have any, it's not obvious that it's going to have any medicinal properties. So the patent law does allow you, if you come up with one drug, one enantiomer, if you can find another enantiomer of the same active ingredient, you'll get another 20 years. So that's another way that you can extend, evergreen your patent portfolio. If you don't have that kind of situation, your drug is not a new chemical entity, you can try to do combination patents. So you take an old drug that's used already out there for something known for, let's say, for treating, hemorrhagic shock. It's well known for that. You combine it. If one of the combination drug is already known for that indication, if you can show a synergistic effect, that's considered not obvious. So that's what you're trying to do there with combination patents. It can be additive. That's not patentable. Sometimes if you can come up with closely related indications, that's another way to just sort of, like if there's indications where when you treat one thing, you also treat something else, those are a problem. For example, perfect example is in septic shock. When people go into septic shock, they oftentimes have multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. So those are kind of closely related indications. They're different. There is no drug approved to treat multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. You have to have at least 2 different systems. So it makes sense to, if your drug also does that, you should file, patents for that closely related indication. So that's another way that people expand their patent portfolios. I've talked a little bit about trade secret already. The risk of keeping something as a trade secret, it can always be reverse engineered. The advantage is that it can last forever, potentially, if nobody reverse engineers it without, some sort of fraud involved. If Pepsi figures out a way to make Coca-Cola without relying on somebody on the inside giving them information, then they can do that legally and without any issues. So I'm going to move now into how do you commercialize things. And these are just the typical, so you've obtained the patent now. Now you have to figure out how do you monetize the patents. Typically, you enter into a licensing agreement, right? So the license is basically you're granting the patent rights that you've obtained to a big size, mid-sized pharma company that have more financial resources, that have the capabilities in place to market and sell that drug so that you can then make some money. You get upfront payments, right? They all include an upfront payment, and usually you don't have to give it back. So, even if the drug fails, you walk away with your nice upfront payment. So people push for licensing agreements because, hey, you get if you can get a nice chunk out of that. You want it to succeed. You also get payments when they achieve regulatory milestones, for example, completion of phase 1, phase 2, those are regulatory milestones. When they sell a certain amount of the product, you get paid X amount of dollars depending on the royalty rate. Usually it's anywhere, I would say 10 to 20. That's a fair of the net sales. That's how much you will get, and the company will keep the rest because they're putting up most of the money to commercialize, to sell and manufacture the drug. Typically, licenses, they can happen even in preclinical stage, but usually that's it depends on the indication. So cancer drugs, diabetes, Alzheimer, sometimes they can license even at the preclinical stage. Most other drugs would be typically they want to see you do one proof of concept, phase 2 study. Phase 1 is just safety. So most people will wait for you to complete at least phase 2 or phase 3 before they talk about licensing your drug. It's specific for different indications. You have to say the field, usually it's human and animal. And then you can do country specific or just or globally. So there's different, you have a lot of latitude there. The other main agreement is what's called co-development agreement or JDAs. It's almost identical to licensing agreements. The main difference here is that usually there's a higher upfront payment than a straight licensing transaction. Sometimes company, smaller entities like a university, when I say small, I mean in terms of or non-pharma entity, you do have to contribute something. That's why it's called co-development. So you have to contribute to the cost of developing the drug. And usually that happens early on. It can be preclinical stage, phase 1. The drug has a promise. You don't have all the resources to develop it. You want to get a pharmaceutical company involved. They'll come in. It basically goes like this. The more money they have to put in, the less upfront payment you're going to get and that sort of stuff. So if you can contribute, the more you can contribute, it's not only money, it's also in terms of what they call FTEs, basically effort, right? That you have like staff and dedicated staff and people that are going to help to do the experiments. Experts are all at the university. The more they take part in the development of the drug, the more leverage you have in terms of when you get to, what's going to be the revenue split? If you can say, well, our scientists contributed to developing most of this, you didn't really do much, and so you have leverage the more contributions you make to the co-development. And that's pretty much how it goes. Like I said, the more, if you don't have the money to contribute, or you don't have the resources to contribute, then usually they'll pay for it. The big drug company or mid-sized firm will pay for it, but that's going to be in exchange for some form of reduced milestone payments, right? So maybe instead of, $2 million up front, they may say, well, it's only going to be $1 million or whatever, 5 versus 2.5. So that sort of stuff. The next one is just a pure collaborative research agreement. And this is usually very early on. Maybe you have a drug company. It's somewhat like the co-development, but usually it's extremely early. And the most important thing here, you see oftentimes the drug company will just they'll become what's called an optionee. So they'll have like some sort of set time frame. Maybe it could be a year. And if the drug and the experiments show any promise, then they'll say, okay, we want to have the option to license it if we do, X number of experiments. And if it looks good, we'll collaborate, same sort of stuff, in kind, contributions in terms of facilities, sharing equipment, services, technical expertise, all of that sort of stuff. So all of that kind of looks like the co-development. But the main thing is usually there's an option to license the technology after set studies are completed. This one comes up all the time. It says common MTAs. You have to have this agreement in place. There's usually lots of confidentialities in all of these agreements. But this is particularly, it comes up a lot in MTAs. You want to also make sure that the scope of the approved research plan needs to be in place. You're basically giving someone, you have this exciting material, the drug company wants to do experimentation on it. So you have to make sure that you keep real tight control over what's going to be done, okay, what indications are going to be investigated, all of that sort of stuff. And who's going to own what? If there's a new IP that comes up that's not part of the scope of the approved research plan. So you give them this drug in order for them to go after some specific type of cancer, prostate cancer. And then they decide, well, they're going to also look at glioblastomas. And then they discover that, well, that molecule, so that's outside of the scope of the approved research plan. So who owns that IP that was generated with your drug that falls outside of the approved research plan? So you have to make sure that you put provisions in the MTA as to who's going to own that, and if they go outside the scope. And if you're not going to own it, the university is not going to own that. The university should at least get right of first refusal or something. It can work the other way too. Even if the university negotiated that if you use this for like some sort of an indication that's not part of the approved research plan, we get to own that new IP, and the drug company will say, okay, that's fine, but we should have the right to license it from you. We should have the right of first refusal. We use your drug for an indication that wasn't approved, but we want to be the first. Since we did the work, we should get the right to license the drug from you, the patent rights. So that's why the MTAs get kind of interesting in that way. So this is just, what do you call it? It's just, sometimes people come up with hybrids, agreements that, where you have like aspects of licensing and co-partnering. In this case, co-partnering meaning sort of co-development. You can have where it's a mix of both, meaning you're doing a licensing agreement, but a co-development agreement. You may start off that way, but you may say, well, if this drug, if we file it and we get a really great phase 1 result, we want to just license it from that point, straight licensing agreement. And so you can have that sort of, the drug company can request things like that as part of the licensing agreement, that or the co-development agreement, I'm sorry, they have an option to license it if a specific milestone is achieved. So that's different variations of what people can ask for. This last one it's called like a drug discovery and co-development collaboration agreement. There's lots of similarities, but because you're talking about, it's usually focused a lot on commercial milestones. This arises a lot of times with a company that has a big drug company with a lot of commercial capabilities. And so it allows you to go much quicker. Usually there's much bigger upfront because they're committing resources very early. So it's a drug discovery. That's the most important distinction here. They're coming in early. They're going to help you identify a lead compound, and basically the more a drug company does, then the more, they're going to, it's like the idea of no free lunch, I guess. The more stuff if they're coming early, and they're helping you to identify the lead compound as part of the drug discovery process, then, they're going to want a bigger slice of the pie. You have to have a development plan. There's usually like a joint steering committee and what have you. You have to have developmental milestone payments will be put in there and what have you. So if you achieve even if it's a preclinical milestone, so it works both ways. They're coming in early, so they're going to get a bigger piece of the pie. But in addition to that, the university will also get opportunities to secure revenue much quicker because let's say when they identify a lead compound, they're going to get a check, even though it's very early on. So that's the distinction with a drug discovery agreement. Most of the other stuff remains the same, but that's the main distinction here. So what happens if none of these pan out, right? You didn't get any of those, no licensing agreement, no co-development agreement or a commercialization agreement, and you are a company that was started, let's say, from the university, or even if you're not, you have to figure out how do you go on. You get the drug approved by the FDA, but you don't have a licensee in place to market and sell the drug. You may try to go public, right? If you have great data, great phase 3 results cleared by FDA, you can use that to go public off of, right? Especially if it's an indication that the public is very interested in. There's also companies that can serve as your marketing and sales arm. You can actually hire them. And the deal is, and you probably can tell the theme here is, the more they have to spend, the less you're gonna get. So there's gonna be some sort of revenue split, right? They say, wow, you got your drug approved, but you didn't get a licensing deal done, or you don't have a co-development deal done. And we can help you. We can put up the money to make the drug, sell the drug. We'll bring out, as if you have a licensing deal done. We'll do all of that. But they'll want a greater piece of the pie because they're putting up more money because you don't have a licensing. But there is a pathway, even if you don't secure a licensee. Again, you can always go public as well to try to raise money that way. So typically in this space, okay, yeah. So how do you typically let's say you want to form a spin out from a university and you want to form a company. Most people use, I think one of the decoders now is becoming just as important, but a lot of people still stick with Delaware, right? Because Delaware just allows your future investors, there's a lot of tax incentives to just go with a Delaware C Corp. So most people in this business, if they want to form a new co or a joint venture company, they go with just form it in Delaware. And so that's typically what people do. To accelerate the specific areas, let's say you have specific IP that you want to accelerate. One way you can do that is to form a new company with sort of like a joint venture. You get another company that has a lot of resources, and you guys form this joint venture company, and you can go ahead and it just allows you to go much quicker. You do have to make sure that you discuss things like who's going to own improvements to that IP that was used to form that joint venture company, right? Because you wanted to speed ahead, go ahead. But if you generate new IP, you got to decide who's going to own that. And if you form, you have to always worry about an equity split, right? So who's going to, I think I wanted to discuss this one earlier. I'll come back to it. But it's basically who's going to own what percentage is going to be owned by whom, right? That's a very important thing that comes. So anytime you form a company, you have to decide that. If they're doing more and they're bringing more to the table, they're going to maybe want 60-40 and that sort of stuff. But the benefit of forming a new co or a joint venture, instead of trying to do everything alone, is that you can again, speed is of the essence. You can speed up things a lot by doing that. You want to decide who's going to be responsible for regulatory filings, right? Your formula joint venture, you're going to have also non-competes are important. So with respect to, they're bringing, let's say you're doing a combination product. They're bringing one drug and you're bringing the other drug. Usually you want to have in place like a non-compete with your drug molecules. Let's say you're bringing a kinase, right? Some sort of specific kinase or whatever it is, you want to make sure you can put in language that says you're not allowed to compete with, you don't get to go out and work with another company that's in that space and vice versa. So that's important. Just with respect to this, you want to always, even if you're doing, trying to get equity, which I'm going to talk about, how do you finance companies, you always want to, also try to pursue non-dilutive funding, and one of the ways, these are just different sources of that, SBRs, what have you, but oftentimes people forget that the Department of Defense, they do fund a lot. So you really want to check into that, wider grants. The grants also help you with equity financing because it's a validation of your science. So that's why people put a lot of focus on it. As a company, if you can get those grants, federal grants, it's a validation for your potential investors. They look at that as, your science and technology is solid. There's also companies like BARDA, and MTech. They work with the government and what have you, and they can help to facilitate these. They receive a lot of requests for proposals for all kinds of fundings. It costs it's less than $5,000 a year to become a member of MTech. So I think that's worth it to join an organization like that. If you have formed a company off of the research at the university. There's also grant writing companies. They'll basically not charge you anything, and they'll write the grants, and they'll even read submissions and what have you. But when you get the grant, then you pay them. So that's also important. Okay, I've already discussed this. The one other thing is that's also funding, right? So funding is very important. So you have to decide, how are you going to finance it between the two parties that have come together to form this joint venture. So that's extremely important also. Equity financing, that's the main way that people fund this stuff. You have seed rounds, so that's early on. Some people, if you want to go super fast, you can get into this convertible notes, right? That's how they use convertible notes. It's a debt instrument. The main difference is it does have a trigger. The trigger is usually you have to raise some amount of equity. So the investor is taking a lot of risk. They're willing to write that check right away, and you can get started. But they will have what's called a maturity event, a trigger event, which will mean if you don't raise, let's say, set amount of equity by within a certain amount of time, you have to pay them the money back, right? Now, you can ask for an extension anytime you get to that maturity date if you have not satisfied that maturity event, meaning you didn't go out and raise equity, however amount. As long as you can secure 50.1% of all the debt holders, then you're good to go for another year, another day to survive, basically. I mean, people use them because early on, there's a lot of risk involved in pharma. So people sometimes don't want to write a check if it's not a convertible note. But if you can get straight equity, it's always best because it's just straight equity that doesn't involve any convertible. You don't have to worry about maturity dates and trigger events and all of that stuff. The other types of agreement is what's called a simple agreement for future equity. This essentially means that it usually allows them the investor's going to basically have some sort of cap on their investment. They might say that none of my investment is not going to be overvalued. Your valuation is going to remain. My investment is always going to remain under 10 million. So let's say your company goes from being valuated at 10 million to 50. Their investment is capped at 10. So they're always going to own a lot of your company, right? Because even if your company's getting, the valuation is increasing, it doesn't dilute them. They never get diluted because they capped it at a very low valuation. So that happens, with the safe investment, the safe agreements. That can be the case. You have, it's kind of like there's usually an event. You say, for example, if you achieve this, let's say some sort of equity financing, at that point, my valuation would kick in. So that's why it's called, this is basically simple agreement for future equity. So I'm not going to say what my investment right now, what my valuation is going to be determined at a later event. So basically they allow the investors to convert their investment into equity, typically at a fixed valuation at a later financing round. And it's usually going to be discounted for them. So that's why investors, they like that. But for you, it gives you money quicker. And again, speeds everything in this business. You want to get your product on the market as soon as possible for your investors. So that's why that's important sometimes to consider investments like that. The straight equity transactions usually happen after the seed round. So if you get into Series A, B, and C, that sort of stuff, that's when they kick in. It's usually always almost, just straight equity transaction. This is called a convertible preferred shares. Some shareholders will get that, but the advantage to them is they get a steady 4.5% dividend before any dividend is paid. So if you get to the point where you're actually paying dividends out, if somebody has a convertible preferred shares, so these are just different things that investors will use or you can use to sweeten the deal to get your money. You might say, okay, I'll give you convertible preferred shares, and this is kind of the advantage to them. You always pay them first, and they always receive a 4.5% dividend before any dividend is paid to anybody else. So there's just different sort of instruments that are relied on. But the main thing is it helps you to go faster. So how do you fund a potential commercial enterprise? I think I already did this slide. So you have to have a very clear problem that you're going after. Whatever it is that you're going after in terms of your presentations, it has to be laid out pretty well. For example, here we're talking about you have to show all the shortcomings of the prior inventions and what have you, and standard of care In this case, you can see this is, you're trying to treat septic shock. Most of the times you give the antibiotics, it fails, doesn't correct the problem. You give volume expanders to correct the hypovolemia, essentially, mainly absolute hypovolemia. So basically blood vessel rupture and that sort of stuff. It doesn't work. And when that fails, now they're in septic shock. You give them vasopressors that are meant to raise the blood pressure. Since all the standard of care fluids have failed, it's supposed to also treat the relative hypovolemia, but it doesn't. And then when that fails, people are put on ECMO, and most of the times this is episodic. It usually just doesn't work, and then death is the result. So whatever the problem is, you have to describe it very well in order to get interest from your investors. It's kind of the point of that slide. And then, like with everything, you have a problem, you have to show a solution, to the problem. In this case, we're using micelles and liposomes to treat not only relative absolute hypovolemia, which is out there. I think it's about 70% of the time it works. The other 30% of the time it doesn't work. But there is no drug to treat relative hypovolemia, for example, in our case. So you want to make points like that, novel points that drugs have not been able to treat. So you stress things like that, and you get some interest. Next thing, you always have to show do some sort of market assessment, no matter what it is. This is just an example of that. I'm using our VBIS here. We show a pricing that we think based on our cost of goods sold, how much we think it's going to be cost. And then we have two categories, people that are in severe sepsis and all the people that die from septic shock. And we allocate, different number of courses, 1 and 1.5. If somebody's dying, you're obviously going to use more of the drug to try to save them. So these are just straightforward kind of things that you do. And then you have different markets. And everything else is the same, except the pricing is going to differ, depending on the part of the world you're in. And so that's basically the sort of analysis that people are accustomed to seeing, some sort of market opportunity assessment like that. You always have to show some sort of competition, right? In this case, we're just looking at VBIS versus what's the competition, the standard of care products for septic shock. And you just, you go through the differences between them. You can see, essentially, we have a lot of yeses here for the VBIS and a lot of no's for all the other standard of care products, albumin, geopressor, which is a pressor, and this other drug. So that's sort of stuff that you would do regardless of whatever it is that you are investigating. Here, we should show, if you're raising money, it's basically use of funds. You have to show that. And you can see we have 11 million, it's a 20 million raise. You have to say what the pre-money valuation is, and you will have to show how you got to that pre-money valuation. And then you just have to show the breakdown of how you get to each of the numbers, or what you're going to use the funds for. They're giving you money, they want to know how do you plan on using the money. So this is just, I don't know if you can see it's kind of small, but this is just one way that you can do a comparative valuation to get at your valuation. You're basically looking at other companies that are similar. In this case, and usually try to be very conservative. So, we're going after, let's say this company, Laola Pharma. They made geopressor, right? We know that geopressor is not an adequate representation. We think we are superior to that. But this company was able to get about 329 million of valuation. So our argument is that if they got that and we think we're superior to that company, we have a good chance we can justify telling someone that we think we, deserve to have 100 million valuations. And then you look at similar other companies, not only in that your niche area, but just other companies that were at a similar stage of development. And you see the different numbers, on average, the minimum was like 5.1 billion. We're not saying that we are 5.1 billion, but I think if you take all of this in the totality, you can make the case that we think that the 100 million that we're thinking as our pre-money valuation, it can be justified. But the point of that slide is just that you have to show support as to why you think your company's value, has a pre-money valuation. This is just sort of making the same sort of argument in a different way. In this case, we're looking at, these are some drugs. This is Zygris that Dr. Simpkins had mentioned, anti-thrombotic drug that was supposed, I think this drug sold for about $7,000 from Eli Lilly. It was supposed to revolutionize septic shock. It didn't. It ended up getting taken off the market. But they sold it for $7,000 a course. Right now, with respect to our drug, we're saying maybe $1,500. You can see, you sort of make those sort of argument. We think that, if this drug doesn't do a lot of things that it's supposed to do, and so far we are doing that. We're able to achieve things that that drug never achieved. If we compare it to GeoPressor, which is just a pressor, one thing here you'll see, the people talking about the cardiac scores, they talk about the cardiac scores. GeoPressor, they didn't really have, they got a reduction in just the cardiovascular SOFA score. Okay, it was observed. There was no decrease in the overall SOFA score. And GeoPressor is from Laola, the company that was worth 300 and something million, right? So clearly, relatively inferior product. It only, it doesn't address most aspects of septic shock. And we think, our drug does that. So you're basically, again, making an argument as to why you think your drug should be valued the way to justify that. Here, when you get for reimbursement, it's essentially they look at whether the drug is new, how costly it is. Believe it or not, it has to be more costly, and then whether it has substantial clinical improvement. So those are the three criteria that people use to try to prove that, support that you're going to get the pricing that you think you're going to get. Here, if you can get any kind of designation, for example, breakthrough designation for your drug, or QIDP, in this case it's called Qualitative Infectious Disease Product, right? If you can get it, these designations will help improve your chances that Medicare will reimburse, you'll get reimbursement. This is just like an attempt to, you have to do some sort of, all the investors want to see some sort of return on investment. And people use a 14% discount rate normally when they do this stuff. If you look at here, you have what you're raising, your pre-money, your post-money, and then, this gives you the ownership percentage. If investor A puts $5 million, the entire raise is worth 16. So you're basically taking the 5 and into the 120. That's how you figure out the ownership. And then down here, they normally use a discount rate of 14%, meaning that's, at the very least, that's the rate of return that most people expect. So if we go to the next page, you'll see you're kind of using this formula essentially, right? Where F is the amount of projected cash flow and of the year, and N at the bottom there at the top, the exponent is the number of years of cash flow in the future, and your discount rate is plugged in here to R. So 1 plus, in this case, will be 1 plus 0.14, 14%. And you kind of figure that out, and then you back end into all of these numbers. If you have only 30% income, the investor is going to make that amount of about 37%, X, 49X if you can achieve pricing at 40% of income, and so forth. Just to make the point that you kind of have to have this sort of stuff. This just goes into more detail as to your numbers per year and what have you, number of sales, and then you have your COGS, meaning how much you think you're going to sell the drug. How much it took to produce like a specific amount of the drug, and what have you, pricing, and that's pretty much that's it. And you use this to back into the other stuff, but you do have to show some sort of support for your how you got to your return on investment. You have to show a team, and people want to see that your team has experience doing this sort of work. In this case, you show everybody, founder, CIO with trauma surgeon with 30 plus years of experience. Here, a Duke educated physician. It's important to show stuff like that. Works at all the big drug companies here. Dr. Kumar filed over 1,000 clinical trials in 40 different countries. It gives credibility and what have you. Myself, I've been involved for 18 plus years at different levels in this industry, as I explained earlier. I think I'm just about at the end. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions with respect to like authorship publications on grants and papers. We have very strict rules and regulations and definitions for who should be an author, and I wonder for patents. In the medical school we have a lot of students that come in and will do a little bit on an experiment, come in and out at different times, or other scientists that may contribute. So are there sort of definitive rules? Obviously, if you contribute knowledge, innovative knowledge, that would not have made the project possible without that. But how do you evaluate a person's contribution, whether or not they should be on the patent? And my second question with respect to that is, should everybody, if everybody's thinking in a patent, sort of patent application terms, do you have to then think about the people that are working for you in your laboratory and, getting non-disclosure agreements with them? Because as you know, with students, et cetera, or, research staff, it's very easy for them to talk about aspects of the experiment outside of the laboratory.
Yeah, I'll take the second part of that. You definitely need to, as part of whether it's an employment agreement, you definitely need to incorporate non-disclosures in the employment agreement. Make sure that doesn't happen. If it's an issue of trade secret, you need to limit how many people have access to that. I guess you don't typically deal with a lot of trade secrets at the university, but just the non-disclosure and confidentiality. I would say also you can't go over the board with non-competes, because the courts don't really like people, it's frowned upon inhibiting people's ability to earn a living. But I would say, sometimes at least they shouldn't be able to work for a very close competitor, at least for a short amount of time. So sometimes people put that in there. You cannot make that a very long length of time where you keep somebody from being able to be gainfully employed. But definitely the confidentiality and non-disclosure should absolutely be part of any employment agreement, what have you, because that's all you have, right? You don't want them disclosing to potential competitors, somebody that can scoop you, get to an invention or an aspect of your invention before you got the resources to do it. A lot of people have much more resources than you. If they hear about it and you haven't filed a patent, they can, they go for it, right? So you have to really limit that. The first part was, I guess, an event. Who gets listed? So one thing, it cannot and should not be like how you put people on papers. As far as an inventor, there's a lot of latitude as to who gets put on a publication, journal article. You cannot take that same approach with respect to who gets listed as an inventor. There's two parts of invention, right? The first part is conception. So if somebody came up with the concept, even if they did not participate in the other half is what they call reduction to practice. So that's basically the invention. Conception and then reduction to practice. If a person participated in either of those two things, conception is easy to understand. The reduction to practice, there's two types of that, right? One's what they call an actual reduction to practice. That usually occurs when people are building things, like a medical device or something. That's actual reduction to practice. So you took a concept and you actually built a device. For therapeutics, usually it's constructive reduction to practice. So when you file a patent, that's considered constructive reduction to practice. I mean, suppose you can have actual reduction of practice if you made the drug or manufactured the drug and what have you. But basically, those are the two components. So just because somebody is actually working on the second part is a bit tricky. I mean, it has to be, everybody can understand the first part, conception. Did they think about this? Did they, come up with this, using this drug to treat this indication? Was it all their idea? If it was, you're obligated to list them as an inventor. Because if you don't, and later on is disclosed, your patent can actually be invalidated, believe it or not. So that's something very important to make sure that everybody that goes on that gets listed as an inventor deserves to be there. And you definitely don't want to leave somebody off that should have been listed as an inventor. The second part, where did they contribute towards an inventive step? That's a little bit, say, possibly a gray area, but I mean, it's essentially, it's not sort of like, if you, let's say you hire a company and you give them all the instructions, the blueprint to conduct the experiments, just because you are not conducting the experiments doesn't make them an inventor, right? Because you designed everything. You're just not doing the experiments yourself. So an inventor is not necessarily somebody that actually did the experiments, right? It's more like the person that came up with the experimental design, was involved in, without them being involved, you wouldn't have been able to get the results and what have you. The technician, I'm just going to say technician or the grad student, technician may or may not be an inventor in that sense. If you're laying out everything, right? You come up with all the experimental design and everything, and they're just sort of implementing, what you gave to them, the blueprint that you came up with the blueprint. Typically, you would be the inventor and not necessarily them. Now, if you run into a problem and without their help, you could have not arrived at your invention, then that's another, situation, especially if they contributed what's called an inventive step. Like maybe you weren't even conceiving or thinking about an aspect of that drug that the drug could even be used to treat or address something else. And the second person came up with that idea. And now you want to put that as what they call an embodiment, which are basically sort of like inventions within an invention, right? You have all the different embodiments, all the different applications. They came up with a whole new application of your drug that you never conceived. They conceived it, right? And they came up with that. You probably should list them as an inventor. So that's sort of what I would say. Yeah.
Just an extension of the same
Thank
thing.
you.
You're welcome.
So if somebody has done, contributed to the invention substantial part, and other people just join them, which they feel that they should be included, is there something like a primary inventor? Do you assign like 50% or 60%, 20% to others?
No, so the way they do it is you go by, so every patent has claims at the end. The claims are basically your legal rights, right? So if you get a patent, you take a look at the last page, you would normally see the claims in a patent. That's basically what you own. That's the property rights. And so you really should do a claim by claim analysis to see, you could have multiple inventors because that claim, let's say, I'll give you an example, use of the drug to treat, let's say, multiple MS, multiple sclerosis, right? And maybe that's the first claim. And then you have to figure out in your lab which party actually came up with the inventive steps to get that claim. So as far as, there's not really a primary and secondary, like how you have primary author or secondary author, you just call them inventors. And, one person, and they don't say, claims 4 through 5, was invented by X person. They just list the inventors. But you have to get together and say, okay, these claims, we wouldn't have been able to get these claims without this person's. They came up with a concept. They don't have to come up with both. They don't have to have conceived it and help you to reduce it to practice. As long as they participated in one aspect. If somebody just came up with a concept, even if they did nothing else, you should list them as an inventor, right? So that's kind of where it goes. And you go claim by claim to decide, one claim may be for one thing, and then usually you start off with a big claim, and then you kind of they have like independent claims and dependent claims and what have you. So there's different claims, and the best way to do it as far as really trying to pin down inventorship is to go claim by claim and see who contributed to inventive step to each of them. I mean, in my opinion, I think it's always better to err on the side of listing people as opposed to not listing people. But I mean, it can cut both ways. At the same time, it's not a paper, it's not a journal article where you just list everybody on there. They really had to have either contributed to one of those two things. Either they came up with a concept for one of the claims, or they help you to reduce the invention. Without their involvement, you would have had no idea how to design the experiments, how to get to the end, and to prove that you have support for your claim. So every claim in the patent, you have to have support for it in the specification, the rest of the patent, right? So that's where the experiments and all that stuff comes into play. And if that person but for that person's involvement in terms of not just doing the experiment, but the fact that let's say it's a more higher level, right? They designed everything. They basically help you to test and vet out the idea. Without their involvement, you couldn't have done that. That person is an inventor. That's kind of, yeah.
Dr. DeShield, I'd like to thank you very much. I know we're over, so if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to come up. And I do see Dr. Shilpa Bavar has a question that you may want to answer.
Okay.
But thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much. Please do being here.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent talk. Very excellent.
Thank you.
So Shilpa had a question about
Okay.
key terms to look for in an intellectual property policy that's offered by a university, and have you had success in negotiating down an IP policy at a university?
I've done some aspect, I guess kind of, in terms of, I've done like sort of where I'm here in that sense, like, made presentations at universities and try to help them with like, how do you, there's IP in the classrooms and all that kind of stuff, like in terms of just helping to review the policies, IP policies generally at the university. So I've done some stuff like that. But yeah.
So my experience has been that universities are pretty firm in terms of their understanding of the distribution characteristics of IP. So when they expect a certain percentage, they typically don't wiggle on that, because otherwise it establishes a precedent for other groups to come in and get a different favored rate. So my understanding is that the rate policies don't typically change, but there are constantly conversations about things like co-discovery. So when an industrial partner comes in to work with the university, those become very protracted conversations, and they won't let you start your research until you've figured out what you're doing in terms of co-discovery.
Yeah.
So the policy that has to do with co-discovery can be convoluted, but it's got to get hashed out. And then the percentage ownership is something that's typically not moved on.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about right. I know like some schools and stuff, first of all, like in terms of who owns the patent, it's always assigned to your employer, right? So the inventors don't own it, but if you work as part of your employment agreement, everything will be turned over to the university. That sort of stuff, sometimes that seems to people kind of intuitive, but that happens as a condition of your employment agreement. Usually you have to assign everything to them. I believe as an inventor, sometimes there's added benefit in terms of, if the drug gets licensed, the patent rights, as an inventor, some people do get checks in addition to their employment agreement. So the prolific inventors at universities sometimes benefit if the patents are ever licensed out. They can get checks for being, that's one of the benefits of being listed as an inventor, if it ever gets monetized in that way. So, yeah, there's that. But most of the, in terms of the, there's pretty standard IP policies at most universities. It's sort of a little bit of a cookie cutter, sort of thing. It's not very exciting.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have luck.